So for this week's stuff, there is no primary source reading this week, mostly because most of the material about the Mycenaean Greeks is actually from a later time and is more indicative, more reflective of the classical Greeks, who we'll be talking about next week. So, but there is a quiz, which I forgot to put on the slide. So make sure that you take the quiz and have that taken care of by Sunday. Also, keep thinking about the research essay, and I'll have everything back to you guys shortly. Let's talk a little bit about last week's reading, the images from the Minoans. How did you guys react to this? Was this a welcome change of pace? Was this too little to work with? What did you guys? What kinds of ideas, conclusions were able to draw about the Minoans? Yeah.
That they found for goddesses to be divine, and that in a lot of their imagery, the person in the middle of the image was perceived to be the divine.
Right, and that seems to be, sort of placement. Sometimes they're elevated, and do you guys think that that's valid? Do you think that that's something that we might be reading into that, or is there something to support that in the images that we're looking at? Yeah.
I feel also nature was a big part in a lot of these rings, because a few of them had trees in it, fruits, birds. Yeah.
Right, and so it ties in with what we were saying about the Minoans, that they seem to situate the divine in the heart of nature, which makes sense. What else? What else are we getting from the images? Yeah.
I think there's just still so many questions about when are these rituals done, and specifically who is the person that engraved? I mean, relative to the people before me, who is the person that's us, looking at the rituals?
Right. So, who's the audience for these images?
Yeah.
Right. And yeah. So the context of these images doesn't give us a lot of information, because the actual objects are signet rings, which are used to make impressions onto wax or clay as a means of providing. We saw this too with the Sumerians, right? The Sumerians have these cylinders with images embedded around the outside that are rolled across clay at the bottom as a kind of image-style signature. So the context for all of that, for the Minoans, is completely lost to us. And we don't know the extent to which these are universal images, or whether they're associated with particular clans or particular cities. We've seen a lot of cultures where the mythology and the pantheon and the way that the stories are told, the rituals are conducted, is different from city to city, even within a culture. But our knowledge of the Minoans is so limited that we don't have a sense of the extent to which something like this is Minoan, or reflected specifically of Knossos, or one of the other cities in which it was executed. Yeah.
How do we know it was a signet ring as opposed to a talisman or just a decorative ring?
What we know is that the rings themselves are produced in the negative, so that their utility is to press in upon something. And yeah, the circumstances under which that happens, we don't know. From other cultures, like the Sumerians, other cultures in later periods, we have similar setups where people have things that are designed to be impressed on documents as a form of signature. But we don't know if that's what's happening in this case. Yeah.
Yeah.
what you just said about the ring being a stamp, how do we know for certain that the middle finger is a goddess? What if this is just like a family business and that's their brand?
Yeah.
Well, what do you guys think? Is there? This is what I was getting before. Is there anything that we can see in these images that supports the idea of them being religious figures, priests, priestesses, gods, goddesses, anything like that? Yeah.
Oh, I was gonna kind of on what he said. Like I could almost see them being some sort of in some sort of agricultural business maybe,
Yeah.
and so these are like some sort of god for like a harvest or something. And it also shows what they do for business. Maybe the right is like an olive tree or something.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's just like what they did, and then the middle is like the god.
Right. It could be associated with the thing is that we know from the other things that are left behind by the Minoans, and in particular the bench sanctuaries that are found on the mountaintops and in caves and forests, that natural elements are associated with the Minoan religion, and so having the particular kinds of plants on these images is suggestive of religion, at least as much as it is of commerce. The recognizability of them in Crete, what we'll be looking for is olives and grapes. If they were agriculturally commercial, because this is the kind of crop that grows best in the Aegean area, and so it would be something that would be particularly fertile. And the images that we have are not mainly suggestive of that. So again, it's almost supposition.
I feel like one thing in the art that shows that somebody is like divine is the clothing. I think that the mortals are naked and the divine. Because for this one, it said that that person on the left was like a divine person. But it also said that somebody perceived that everyone who's in the middle of the ring is divine too.
Right. So it might be divine adjacent, like the ritual dress. No pun intended, but you know the ritual skirts that we see in a lot of these images on the female characters might be associated with divinity and priestesses serving that divinity, and so we might have a situation where this is a divine figure, and the surrounding figures are supportive, either more minor deities or priestesses. That's a possibility, but the way in which the figures are idealized is also suggestive in terms of their physiques, in terms of the nakedness, and the way in which the torso is defined. Seems possibly suggestive of ritual and or natural potency, but again, we're just speculating. Yeah.
Are the dots around the central figure supposed to be like an aura or a halo, or are those supposed to like represent jewelry that they're wearing?
That's possible. We see this looks more like a necklace here, so this might be. My guess is that since we have what looks like a headdress here.
Oh, it's hair.
So this might be stylized hair, or it might be, and we have the same thing here, right? So here we have hair, and then here we have the dots on top of the hair. So these, and then here we have short hair. This is a male figure. And so I think with these female figures, what we're looking at is hair plus a headdress, which is brocaded or in some other way best represented on something this tiny and difficult to carve or difficult to design as dots. It's tough because we don't have, we have other kinds of imagery that's like the bull leaping images that show Minoan, body idealization in more mundane circumstances, but we don't have a lot of these images in the paintings and frescoes that we've excavated in the Knossos and the other archaeological sites, which is interesting in and itself, right? The fact that we have a few of these in paintings, but a lot of them didn't. A lot of the ones that might have been like this didn't survive intact, and so we end up with bull leaping. We end up with jumping dolphins, and we don't have the corroboration we need to show what these would look like in a different medium. Yeah.
Have we found anything that's been stamped by those signet rings?
That is a good question, and I'm not sure. I'm inclined to say not much, because what we seem to have is the rings themselves, but I don't know for sure.
Okay.
So, yeah.
For the first art that, like the first image, and how it represents like a mortal picking a fruit from the tree,
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask, what is that
That's good.
entity that is all the way to the right of the image? Because it looks like it has a wing, but I really can't tell what it is.
Sure. Oh yeah, that is a good question. It's not universally agreed upon, I think. And for that particular image, I mean, my guess would be a gown, so some kind of a cape. But we don't have. If it is a cape, it would be unusual, because most of the imagery that we have from the signets and from the paintings show the Minoans to be minimally dressed, which might owe as much to climate as to body idealization. So it might represent a wing or something like that that is significant of who that character is supposed to represent. Almost certainly, it's designed to identify who that character is, and we don't have that information. There's a general tendency in the ancient world that hasn't really come up in terms of iconography of the gods. That sounds portentous, right? Iconography of the gods, wherein the figures that are commonly known to a culture have a visual representation that is distinctive, so that you can recognize that character without it being labeled in any depiction, any visual depiction. Anybody know what I'm talking about? What would be a good example of this? Yeah.
So bad.
How so?
The crocodile head. We know for certain that there's only one crocodile head god in ancient Egypt.
Right. So for the Egyptians, this is built into the appearance of all the gods. What else? Any other examples that we can think of? If you imagine, Zeus, for example.
Oh.
Right? How do we picture Zeus? Yeah.
Big white beard, long hair, no shirt on.
Well, and
with a toga.
But yeah, he would be dressed as a Greek old man, but he would have something distinctive, something symbolic.
Lightning bolt?
A lightning bolt normally would be used to represent Hercules or Heracles, which is a good example. We talking about later about legend and mythology that's shared across cultures, right? Heracles was present in Greek culture, in Etruscan culture, in Roman culture, and in all of those cultures, not only are similar stories told about him, but he has similar iconography. Anybody know what Hercules would be? Don't think about Kevin Sorbo. Anybody? Can you picture sort of an ancient imagery of Hercules or Heracles? Don't think about the Disney movie either. You're not allowed to think about those things.
What would be striking the DB lion?
Yeah, he would often be wearing a lion skin.
Yes.
With the head over his own head, as a code that says this is Heracles because he fought the lion. And there's a real king in Roman history that wanted to present himself as Hercules, and so he went and procured a lion in which to dress himself in. Also a club. Heracles will often have a knotted club. And so one or the other of these things would be representative of the iconography. And you see the same thing is true across cultures and across time periods. The major gods that everyone would know would be manifested with particular symbols in visual media. And this is the information we're missing. Probably this headdress or this necklace or, I don't know, the shape of her boobs, but something about this image is probably indicative of who this is to the audience that's looking at this. And because we don't have their the text of their mythology, because we don't have the information about how they visualize things from this and it doesn't get passed on to later cultures because the Minoan culture is destroyed. Anything else come up with the Minoan images that you guys thought was interesting or curious or unexpected? Yeah.
I was just wondering if the depictions of the female goddesses, was that because they're of the purpose or the roles those gods were, or were Minoans a sexualized society? Because you also meant the male is also not wearing a lot of clothes, even though he's mortal.
Sexualized in the sense of prurience and
kinda. Almost like a city like Sodom or something. I don't know.
Well, or not hung up about things.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question, actually, and it has been discussed. Believe me. Although by those criteria, I don't know what they would say about 21st century America. But the interesting thing that is relevant about that is that we have the body imagery, but we don't have genitals. And this is in striking contrast to other cultures in which the genitals are a significant part of cultural practice. So, for example, the classical Greeks have these things called herms, which are erect penises that would be mounted, as it were, on the sides of buildings and be focal points of divine power and fertility. And this is something that is an everyday part of cultic practice. There's a very famous young man called Alcibiades in Greek history who was a reckless youth and very popular, a rising leader of the warlike faction amongst the Greeks. And he's about to embark upon a great military expedition, but the night before that, he gets drunk with his friends and goes around the city with them, breaking off all of these penises from the sides of buildings. And this is a religious offense. He's setting out for this expedition, and he's recalled from the expedition in order to stand trial for religious crimes. And the penalty for religious crimes is often death, because the gods are offended and likely to share their wrath with the entire community, not just the wrongdoers. So Alcibiades ends up defecting from Athens. All sorts of other trouble goes on. So the answer to your question is, my inclination would be to say it's less likely simply because we don't have actual sexual iconography, as opposed to the appeal to the ideal of the physical body. Yes.
Yes. About Alcibiades, was he alive during the Peloponnesian War?
Yes. This is
I know
during the
exactly what
Peloponnesian
you're
War.
talking about.
Yeah.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yes. He's very famous for all sorts of things, including making use of the allure of his beauty in order to make headway with men and women alike. Yeah.
The funny thing about it, I actually know about it because of a video game.
Yeah.
Assassin's Creed Odyssey. He's actually a prominent character in that game.
Really? That's
And
interesting.
he's as flamboyant as you're talking about.
Right. Do you get to play him, or is he?
You get to meet him.
Okay. And then you go into a room in the back, and yeah. So anyway, all right. So that's where we're at with the Minoans. Yes.
But also, if it was more focused on fertility, wouldn't you see more genitalia? Because like if you like the modern use of the word sexualization, it's like
Right.
giving cartoon characters big breasts, big thighs, or butts.
Right.
Which is kind of what they seem to be doing here.
Right. But that's because in modern media the human genitals are not allowed to be thought of in a positive way. This is a very modern phenomenon that is relatively recent, the last few centuries. In the ancient world, if your culture revolves around sexuality, then the actual elements of sexuality will tend to be part of your aesthetics and your cultic practice. And so that would be the thing that you would be more likely to see. That said, the reading for last week talked about Sir Arthur Evans and the original conclusions that he brought to the Minoans, and one was that they were matriarchal and female-centric because of the presence of all these female images, and that was debunked by later scholarship. And Evans also put forward the idea that the Minoans were obsessed with fertility. And this has also been debunked partly for that reason, that we have the body imagery, but we don't have actual sexualization. So, but again, we are operating on the basis of corroborating images with other images. And so it's not that we can't know. Because we have enough images, we can start to talk about the kinds of iconography that are prevalent amongst the Minoans. And that was part of the purpose of last week's exercise, looking at all these different images and drawing some conclusions about what their commonalities might be telling us. If we had just this image, there would be no way to be able to talk about the Minoans. But because we have multiple images, we can start to talk about things that were important to the Minoans. Anything else about the Minoan imagery before we progress? All right, so the Mycenaean Greeks. A few weeks ago, we were talking about the Hittites. I introduced you to the Indo-Europeans, and we talked a little bit about how the Indo-Europeans originated in the lands to the north of the Black Sea and were these massive nations of decentralized non-urban, pastoral, and tribal peoples. So what does this mean? This means that that they are very large tribes of shepherds and goat herders. That they rely upon pastoral agriculture. That they rely on pastoral agriculture means that they are dependent primarily on grazing animals, not plowing the land, not on the grain and other produce. They're dependent primarily upon animals for their livelihood. And so, because grazing animals require lots of grazing land, as population increases, they need to move to new lands in order to find this. They are non-urban, which means that they don't build cities. And this has a side effect. If we don't have cities, what does that mean for our ability to understand it? What else do we not have?
Writing?
We don't have writing systems, because writing is an urban technology. What else? What else do we not have? Yes?
Specialization. I mean, different forms of labor.
Specialization of labor. Right? A tribal society is much more simple because urban centers allows you to produce, to diversify labor. Yes.
We don't have stuff that excavate. Like there's nothing.
Right. We don't have archaeological evidence either for the Proto-Indo-European society, because the archaeologists primarily excavate cities where people are laying down durable foundations in stone or other material, and providing a lattice for us to be able to understand the organization of their community. We don't have that for the Proto-Indo-Europeans, the people that are the original source of the Indo-European culture. And so all that we can do is piece together the language that they spoke based on the common elements of the languages of their descendants. Yes.
Why do people cast out that they were urban so quickly? Because like the Mississippians, they built like cities out of wood, and we would never have discovered them if we didn't come so soon after they were wiped out.
That's a great question, and part of the answer may be that we simply haven't found it, but the archaeology of the places that the Indo-Europeans migrate to tell us about the acquisition of urban technology and architecture, which they tend to borrow from the indigenous cultures. So also the language that we've been able to piece together about the Proto-Indo-Europeans tells us about a dispersed and mobile culture that is primarily centered around loosely organized tribes and chieftains. They don't have words they don't have words for cities. They don't have words for elements of urban structure and technology. They don't have words for blacksmithing, shipbuilding, and this kind of thing. So that's the kind of evidence that we have. It's fairly well founded because over the last 150 years there's been a lot of scholarship on the Indo-Europeans through the languages of the peoples that have descended from them, which includes the Hittites, who we've already encountered, the Persians, who arrive around in the other direction in the early Iron Age, the Greeks, who we're talking about now, the Mycenaean Greeks, and the Romans, as well as later peoples like the Slavs, the Germans, and off to the east, the Hindus. So all of these people, these Aryan peoples, have in common these linguistic elements, and we piece together elements of their culture, how they depended upon, pastoral agriculture, and how they were dispersed and spread out in individual tribes that had a sense of collective identity. And we've gotten a rough sense of some of the things that early Indo-European peoples seem to have had in common in terms of religion. This is less sure than our linguistic evidence. And the idea is why we would have trouble piecing together a sense of the Indo-European religion based on the practices of the Indo-European peoples. Yeah.
Well, because as we've already talked about in class, most of these deities are made from natural phenomenon, which could be found anywhere in the world. So, if the Indo-Europeans and Greeks have a rain god, they probably had one back home too, because there's rain there too.
Right.
Stuff like that.
But so we have the possibility of, sort of a spontaneous awareness of a need for a particular kind of God, which might derive from having arrived in a place and, seeing that there's a lot of violence ocean and thinking, this place has a violent sea god, or something that they brought with them. And it's very difficult to tell. It's very difficult to separate the influence of where they migrated to compared to what they might have brought with them. We've already encountered this with the Hittites, the first Indo-European people we talked about, because the Hittites come into Anatolia and encounter the indigenous population and end up developing this very complex religious structure that combines elements from Hittite culture, from Hurrian culture, and from other subject peoples in order to be as expansive and inclusive as possible. So nonetheless, we have a sense of certain things that seem to be indicative, but these are much more uncertain. One is there seems to be, based on the things that tend to show up in Indo-European religions that are less prevalent in other pagan religions. We get things like the sky-earth dichotomy. That's the original story of the nature of the cosmos. Involves a complementary pair of forces. Sometimes this is literally evoked as twins. Although, again, there's some difficulties in applying this in particular cases. Like, so for example, we know that Rome is supposed to have originated with a set of twins, and sometimes this is tied in with this idea, an Indo-European dichotomy. But the actual explanation for Romulus and Remus is that there were two separate stories about the creation of Rome that were passed down on parallel lines across many generations, and eventually they are merged together. And so the story where Rome was founded by a man named Romulus, and the other story told in a different part of the culture where Rome was founded by a man named Remus. Both of these are, based on these are eponymic names. Both of these are based on the name Rome. these stories got merged and they ended up being twins. And then, the logic of the situation is like, well, we can't have both of them, so Romulus kills his brother off, and that's an important character moment for that particular legend. Anyway, the point is, it's difficult to reconstruct. But the prevalence of the sky god in a lot of Indo-European cultures is suggestive. And in particular, the sky god is often associated with the enforcement, the creation or enforcement of order. So as with Zeus, as with Jupiter in Rome, as with Ahura Mazda, the sky god is responsible for, in some of these cultures, for creating in ending the area of chaos.
So do the Etruscans not have that, for instance? Do they not have like a central sky god like the Romans?
Hold that thought, because we will talk about the Etruscans in a couple of weeks. But the short answer is it's very difficult to talk about Etruscan religion because the imagery that we have from them is greatly influenced by the Greeks. And so we actually have a lot of Etruscan deities that are mapped over, that are syncretized with Greek deities. Apollo becomes a very important god amongst the Etruscans in the later period because they have had so much contact with the Greeks. Yes.
Yes. The concept of a sky god, and it's important in most of the Indo-European cultures. Do you think it's related to them being pastoralists?
Possibly. I mean, it would make the division between the mortal world and the sky much more obvious compared to Mediterranean cultures, which would naturally include the sea in that. So I think that's a part of that. There's also an element that came up in the reading, which is a little bit interesting, that the Indo-Europeans seem to have developed lexical gender in terms of religion around the idea of animate versus inanimate gods. And so the earth god is inanimate and female, and the sky god, the thunder god, is animate and male. And these might not have been pictured as being anthropomorphic. These might have been animistic perceptions. In other words, the potency of the mother goddess is infused in the earth and is a latent part of the earth underneath us, whereas the animistic power of the sky god is manifested in thunder and lightning. And this is an active evocation of the preternatural force. They don't necessarily have faces. In fact, it's a possible theory that the effort to picture Indo-European gods as anthropomorphic, as male and female, is driven from comes after this lexical male-female. The forces are male and female, and so they start to put male and female faces and bodies on them after the fact. It's an intriguing possibility anyway. But there seems to be a particularly Indo-European thing that's at least at the outset would have looked for a separation between animate and inanimate, and used male and female genders in language to indicate that. And so that might be worth thinking about as you look at later mythologies and the division between male and female deities. Something also that we talk about in Women Antiquity course. So all this leads us to the Mycenaean Greeks. I have a watch in my hand, and I'm still looking at the phone instead. All this brings us to the Mycenaean Greeks, who are an Indo-European nation of people that arrives in the Aegean world and encounters the existing indigenous population. And just so we're all on the same page, who is the existing indigenous population? The Minoans, right? They encounter the Minoans. And the question becomes, how do they interact with each other? We already have a model for this with the Hittites. What seems to happen with the Indo-Europeans, the Persians do this too, and the Hindus. The Indo-Europeans arrive in a new place. They migrate into the Mediterranean world in search of new pastorlands. And they encounter the indigenous population, which is invariably an advanced, urban, prosperous, highly complex culture. Like the Minoans, like the Harappan civilization of the Indus, like the Hurrians, like the Babylonians encountered by the Persians. So these Indo-European peoples are shepherds and goat herds in massive numbers, but with nothing but ambition. And they see the prosperity and stability and the ability to create a future that these urban cultures have, and they emulate them and surpass them and absorb them. So the Hittites arrive in Anatolia, they encounter the Hurrians and absorb them. The Persians arrive in Iran and encounter the populations of Mesopotamia and emulate them in the building cities and absorb them. The Mycenaean Greeks arrive in the Aegean, they encounter the Minoan palace cities, they emulate them and surpass them and absorb them. So that by the time we get to the climax of the Bronze Age, around 1100, the Mycenaean Greeks have used the Minoan palace system to create an industrial empire like the Minoans, but so successful and so ambitious that they surpass the Minoans and swallow up the Minoan culture and take control over all of the Aegean, with only the Trojans left as potential rivals for control over trade and industry in that territory, which leads to the all-or-nothing Trojan War, the destruction of Troy, and as a result of all the things that happened in the Trojan War, the collapse of the Bronze Age, which I'll come back to in a second. So as you can see here, the Mycenaean civilization starts out with a large population, and they use their success in emulating the Minoans to grow and expand, to proliferate in people, in technology, in wealth. They have an advantage in warfare because the Indo-Europeans rely upon the wheel, on the axle, on the cart and the chariot in a way that Mediterranean peoples don't. Mediterranean peoples rely upon ships. Mediterranean peoples are connected by ships. The movement of goods, peoples, and ideas in the Mediterranean world is done by coastal vessels. And so the use of cavalry and chariots in warfare gives the Mycenaeans an advantage, just as it had the Hittites 1,000 years before. So we have some relics that are left behind. that indicate a impressive culture. A lot of Mycenaean civilization was destroyed or repurposed by later generations. And so there's limited amounts of things that are left behind from the Mycenaeans, but what they speak of is a powerful, wealthy, palace city industrial culture. Modern on the Minoans, but even more excessive, even more driven to the building of wealth and power. And so we have the Lion Gate at Mycenae, which is a passageway into an inner sanctum. Yes.
Since the Minoans were more powerful at like the Mycenaeans' arrival, does that mean that they had cooperation at least in the beginning? Like maybe they started as trading partners, they let them settle the land.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that is.
Sure. The evidence suggests that there's a great deal of contact between them, and originally the Minoans would have not seen the Mycenaeans as a threat because they were not up to their level, and so by the time they realized that the Mycenaeans had built up their industrial and economic power, the Minoans weren't prepared for that. The Minoans are not a militarized people. We have very little imagery of anything military, even naval, for the Minoans. And so it seems like they were very powerful economically, but sedate and possibly even pacifist, but certainly not geared for war the way the Mycenaeans were. So the Mycenaeans were able to sort of take them by storm, mostly economically. There's very little that was in the way of actual conquest. It was mostly surpassing them in trading power until the Minoans were behind them and in a position to be swallowed up. So we have places like this. This is called the Treasury of Atreus, which is at the time the largest enclosed building in the entire ancient world. We have evidence from Mycenaean culture. Unlike the Minoans, we can read their writing. The Mycenaean Greeks. So the Mycenaean Greeks borrowed a number of technologies from the Minoans, and one of these is the writing system. But because the Minoans speak a language that's unrelated to any others. The Minoans are not related to any other culture. They're not connected to anyone else. We can't decipher the writing partly because we don't know their language. We can't piece together their language. We have no contextualization. Unlike putting together the Indo-European language, we are able to do that from all of its descendant tongues. Latin and Sanskrit and Greek and German and English and so forth. We have all these to work with. The Minoan language is isolated and unique and not related, so we can't read linear A, their writing system. But the Mycenaeans speak Greek. They are Greeks. They are the first Greeks. And so, using that, Michael Ventris was able to decipher linear B, and we were able to accumulate a lot of evidence that talks about Mycenaean culture and potentially about Mycenaean religion. So, for example, the Mycenaeans have these large central hearth rooms that are used for offerings. This is a reconstruction of one of these because we don't have any of them intact. So we have this place called a megaron, which in and of itself is interesting because it's positioned within the city. And we also have bench shrines and other things that might have been copied from the Minoans. But they're present in the city. So this is suggestive that they have appropriated the tools and structures of Minoan, Minoan religion, Minoan rituals, but they've applied them to their own sensibility. The Minoans keep their gods out of their cities. The Minoan gods, the Minoan sacred places are situated in the heart of nature. The Mycenaeans placed their hearth rooms and their bench shrines in the centers of their cities. And this is suggestive of the idea that the Mycenaeans expect their gods to be among them. What we don't have is temples. So this might be down to Minoan influence. Minoans don't build temples. And the Mycenaean palace cities, I wasn't expecting incidental music. The Mycenaean palace cities are modeled on the Minoan palace cities. And so they built cities like the Minoan cities in order to be centers of industrial manufacture, and the Mycenaean palace cities don't have temples because Minoan palace cities, they copied the structures and architecture. But they have religious sanctuaries within their cities. And the temples would come for the next wave of Greeks to talk about next week. So there's also in the surviving linear tablets, there are names that survive of particular gods. So what do you think this tells us? If we see names that we recognize, Poseidon, Zeus, Hermes, Artemis, can we do anything with that? Does that suggest anything to us? What can we say about these names amongst the Mycenaean Greeks that we recognize from later mythology? What is that? Does that suggest anything to us? Does that give us a sense of any possibilities? Yeah.
Classical Greeks could have based their religion off the Mycenaeans.
Classical Greeks could have based their religion off of the Mycenaeans. Yes.
That and then also, that.
Yeah. Right? But, yeah.
That makes sense because I was going to point out that some of the arts look like it had like these pillars in it.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah, so some of the other cultural elements definitely survive to later periods that tell us about some cultural transmission. Yes.
Maybe some, I guess, language inherent too, because like Poseidon and both of those look a little bit similar.
Right.
But the other ones don't really.
Right. And the other thing that's interesting to me is that Dionysus appears in some of these records, but only on the fringes of Mycenaean territory. And the later classical Greeks thought of Dionysus as an outsider that was imported into the Greek pantheon. So that might be an early indication of that. The problem, though, is that there are a lot of names that don't show up in both directions. So we have, a lot of names on both the male and the female side that are Mycenaean only, and a number of other names, like Athena and Aphrodite and so forth, that don't show up. That are developments of a later period. And so it seemed the scholarship is weighing in more heavily on the idea that the names might have survived, but not necessarily the stories associated with them. Yeah.
So is that Artemis by the Mycenaean Greeks the same as the Roman one, I'm guessing?
Well, the same as the Greek one, yes. So but we don't know if this Artemis is Artemis is the Greek god of hunting, right? But this Artemis doesn't seem to be associated with hunting, according to the Mycenaean records that we have. This Zeus is not the king of the gods. He is a sky god, just as the classical Zeus is. But the king of the gods for the Mycenaeans seems to be Poseidon, which is suggestive of Minoan influence. So here we have an interesting synthesis. Some of these names that we don't recognize, the Mycenaeans might have brought them with them, or they might be borrowed from the Minoans. We actually can't tell because we don't have enough information. But as with the Hittites, there's a suggestion of a blend, as which tells us something larger, that the Mycenaean civilization that we have is a synthesis of what the Mycenaean Greeks brought with them as a tribal pastoral people, and the culture and civilization of the Minoans. So, the Iron Age Greek pantheon or practices can't be projected backwards. There are many names missing in both directions. And as I mentioned, they have religious sanctuaries, but not temples. And temples are at the heart of the city, are a very important part of classical Greek. So there's a very solid break that takes place between the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization and the rise from the ashes of the classical Greeks that came after. And this is as a result of a number of factors. The Trojan War depletes the manpower and resources of the Mycenaean Greeks. The Mycenaean Greeks expend massive amounts of resources and lives on the Trojan War in order to destroy their only potential rival. And in so doing, they actually exhaust themselves and unbalance their own economy. The nature of bronze economy is unbalanced anyway because it is a luxury good. Bronze is expensive to make because it relies upon copper and tin. And so the manufacture of bronze is an expensive thing and results in expensive products that can only be purchased by the wealthy. And so an economy based upon bronze is constantly chasing more markets, more sources of resources, and becomes more and more misstructured, more and more unbalanced until it finally collapses. At the same time, there's another wave of Indo-Europeans that comes into the Aegean world called the Dorians. So those three factors, the Trojan War, the imbalance of Bronze Age luxury economy, bronze-based economy, and the influx of the Dorian peoples, the Dorian Greeks, means that the Mycenaean Greek civilization completely pancakes. Their economy fails catastrophically, and the cities are abandoned, and the Greeks of the Aegean world have to start over. Yeah.
Was the Trojan Wars, or was that between Troy and just a single Mycenaean city-state, or did the Mycenaeans collectively all go to war against Troy?
The evidence indicates that it was an alliance of Mycenaean Greek cities under the overlord of Mycenae. So it was a particular city that developed a massive alliance of Mycenaean allies. And here's the thing. So the result of that collapse is that the later Greeks hated their ancestors for good question, for failing is so castrated for destroying their own civilization through greed and avarice and ambition. And so this very strongly affects the way that the later Greeks talked about the earlier Greeks. It also very strongly affects how the later Greeks talk about the gods. And so we'll be coming back to that next week when we talk about the Iron Age Greeks and how they used the ambition and greed of the Mycenaeans as an example of what not to do, and how this affects not only their culture but their gods as well. And the literature that we have about the Mycenaean Greeks comes from that hatred, comes from that rejection of Mycenaean avarice. The Iliad and the Odyssey and all the other epic poetry of the Iron Age Greeks is written in order to reject the nature of Mycenaean culture, written in order to cast the Mycenaean Greeks as the bad guys. And so the way that the gods relate to that is very instructive. But that's next week. Let's talk a little bit about mythology, because that relates to both of these topics. So, what is mythology? I don't know if the reading this week helped us in any way to answer that question, because it seemed to be taking great pains to say that we can't say what mythology is. But just in general terms, let's see if we can come up with a possibility. Yes.
So it's a bunch of stories that have been passed down that can tell us about culture or origins.
Stories that have been passed down that can tell us about culture or origin. Yeah.
I actually want to say the difference between mythology and religion. Mythology is a religion that I believe is no longer being practiced, whereas religion is still being practiced. So, for example, we call these myths because we no longer practice them. However, we call the birth of Christ or Isa and all the other religious figures as religion because we still practice them.
Right, and that's a monotheism thing, which is, in other words, because monotheism is about what you're supposed to believe and what you're not supposed to believe, everything that you're not supposed to believe has been categorized as fiction, as mythology. And so it's consigned to the past and to heretics. So in our experience, mythology belongs to the past because of the triumph of monotheism. Yeah.
It's often associated with divination, but that might not always be the case.
Mm-hmm.
Like the myth about Gilgamesh.
Right.
It's not only about the gods, it's about like the human connection towards the
It's
gods.
not only about the gods. Mythology often speaks to the way in which mortals interact with the gods.
Yeah.
And it's often particular mortals. Yes?
I think it's like rituals they perform.
Mhm.
Could be a myth.
But it's often used as an
Not
explanation.
that,
Sorry, go ahead.
so rituals. So I have watched one movie. They have connected with the religion and the people's nature.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be like, it's not really religion, but it's actually how you perform one thing.
Right, how you perform and why you perform. So
Yes,
it's
that's
there
right.
as an explanation of ritual. We talked a little bit about this when we were talking about ritual, the way in which mythology is used as an explanation for ritual. And often there's that thing about how things that show up in ritual actions are symbolic of something that's temporary in ritual but
Yeah.
permanent in the mythology. So part of the problem is that the study of mythology is a modern thing, and the categorization of things as mythology is nowadays done in a condemnatory way. Although this is not solely something that's associated with the modern world. So the contrast between stories and truth is, has some basis in the idea that mythology are things that you believe because they are the stories that have been passed down. They aren't meant to be subjected to reason. They aren't meant to be. They aren't meant to be. They aren't meant to be taken as things that are verifiably true. But it's a different kind of truth. For people in the ancient world, mythology is stories of how people understand the things that that involve non-human things, and so are outside of human experience. It's a different kind of truth. Sort of contrasted with revelation, in the sense that these are not things that are that God is doing now. The gods are doing now. These are, embedded in the fabric of the natural world around us. The reading is a great phrase, autochthonous truth. Anybody know what autochthonous means? It's such a fantastic word. It needs to be brought back. But autochthonous means springing from the ground. Autochthonous means something that is intrinsically native, that emerges from the very essence of the world. And so this is truth that emerges from the essence of the world in which people live. There's a tendency to assume that mythology is descriptive of a particular local identity. And again, the reading used Volksgeist, which just describes, historians and anthropologists love to name things. And so they often try to coin things that other historians and anthropologists use in order to gain currency. And say, yeah, I was the first person to say Volksgeist. But what it describes is a spontaneous expression of identity by people. The Geist is the inherent nature of something. And folk is folk. So this is an expression of the nature. The problem is that we have all of these things that are shared across mythologies. So the question becomes, how do we get shared mythology? How do we get things that show up in the mythology of more than one culture? Yeah.
Different people intermingling in markets or just basic areas of commerce.
Right, so we have diffusion is one possibility, yes.
I think the reading touched on this. It could possibly come from shared rituals, because it seems rituals travel faster than the myths.
Mm-hmm.
So if a couple people perform similar rituals, they might make a similar myth to explain the ritual that they both.
Right. So if a ritual travels from one place to another, then it might prompt the development of the same kind of story to explain it, even if the stories are separate. Yeah.
Conquest.
Conquest, yes. This would also be diffusion of mythology, movement of a story from one place to another. How do we get shared mythology without movement? Without the movement of people? Okay.
I guess it's similar natural experiences around them. So like if, let's say the Nile did flood violently too, maybe they'd also have a myth of a violent flood god, just like Mesopotamians.
Exactly. You have two essential possibilities. So here's another pardon the expression, coinage. So what the book is talking about is in terms of how West Asian cultures, with the Greeks on the fringe of that, share a lot of mythological elements. And so this includes the Babylonians and the Sumerians and the Hurrians and the Hittites and the Syrians, the Canaanites, the Greeks share a lot of components of their mythology according to certain scholars. And we have a number of texts that connect these cultures together, and the underlying shocker, not shocker, but we lose sight of this in modern culture. But these texts that we have that represent ancient West Asiatic mythology, these long texts that we have from Ugarit and Greece and Babylon and Sumer, they are a terminus to something much more important, which is that mythology is intrinsically oral. Mythology is performed oral stories. So these performative readings are dual in nature. They reflect the intrinsic nature of the surrounding world. They speak to a past that has been developed, but they are performed before the current population. Mythology is oral and performative, which means that it is present and immediate for the people that are performing it and hearing it. It is not meant to be dusty old ideas that describe the past. It is meant to be stories that are meaningful to the people that are hearing them. They are immediate and present and urgent. And the written versions of these don't communicate that to us in the way that they should. So we have a number of things that describe what we were just talking about. Some mythology is reflective of universal ideas. Some mythology is disseminated stories. The disseminated stories, like the flood, are particularly indicative to us because the way that the story is told differently in each culture tells us about the values and needs of that culture. So for the flood story, Sumer has a flood story, which is the original source, and it's disseminated through all these later cultures, including the Jews. But the Sumerians have a single survivor named Udanapishtim. Udanapishtim is excluded from the society of humans because he's exempted from death, and it is in the nature of mortals to die. And that is the key lesson of the flood for the Sumerians. For the Sumerians, the key lesson of the flood is universal mortality. And so you must do everything that you can while you're alive. The same story is told by the Jews, but the Jews have the survivor recreate the human race on a more faithful footing, because the purpose of the Jewish version of the flood is to talk about the covenant between mortals and Yahweh. So the point of this is myth responds to the needs and values of a particular culture. Explanations of how mortals came to be are particularly indicative of that. I talked about religion and myth, mythology and memory. So we talked about how with monotheism, myth is set aside because it's not necessary to understand God in this way. For polytheistic myths, we're exploring the separation between the divine and the mortal. So if we think about mythology, myths and kings and rituals are all means of mediating between the awesome destructive power of the divine system, which is inexplicable to us, and the world of mortals that we understand. And so this is how we want to try to look at mythology, is as like ritual, a tool that is used for us to as a connection, as a relation between the mortal and the divine. And we'll talk more about this next week as we encounter the kings of mythology, the classical Greeks. In the meantime, have a great weekend. Remember, there is a quiz that will be due on Sunday. So come to me with any questions about your papers and assignments, and have a good week.